Hey yo! Since the release of my Halo 2 Rebalanced, I haven't stopped making tweaks and additions over the last month and a half, and all of that progress has culminated in 2.0 of Ruby's Rebalanced Halo 2. If you haven't watched the initial release video, I recommend doing so first. This mod is a rebalancing of Halo 2's campaign through weapon, vehicle, AI, level, and difficulty tweaks to let the game reach its full potential. With that, let's jump right in. To start off, I changed a lot of the weapons' rates of fire back to match the original Xbox versions, just to get a more faithful experience to the original, but also because it's an opportunity to fine-tune the weapon balancing by selectively choosing which gun receives the rolled fire rates, such as several dual-wieldable weapons still retaining their Vista fire rates, which helps in giving them a needed buff to keep up with the battle rifle and carbine. With that in mind, the SMG, plasma rifle, brute plasma rifle, and plasma pistol have all received buffs to their damage. First and foremost, I wanted every dual-wieldable weapon to be viable when single-wielded, so damage output and other various attributes have been tweaked accordingly. And as such, dual-wielding needed to be tweaked so it wasn't insanely overpowered, which wasn't that hard to do, honestly. Now firing two weapons at once will incur a much bigger accuracy penalty to varying degrees depending on the weapon, which in turn emphasizes firing one at a time when at range, which is much more accurate. So even with this penalty, dual-wielding still has a unique benefit for not just close ranges, but longer ones too. When these weapons are actually viable on their own, it obviously makes them more fun to use, but it also doesn't force you to forego melee and grenades to use them. Instead of being necessary to make these weapons viable, dual wielding is now an extra option you can choose to employ depending on the situation. And thanks to these tweaks, there's more meaning in the dynamics of how you choose to fire the two weapons you're holding. Moving on to specific weapons, the plasma pistol has received a slew of other neat tweaks. I increased its projectile speed a bit so it's a little easier to use on fast enemies, and changed its overheating and overcharge behavior to be more like its CE counterpart. The time it takes to fire again after overheating is significantly lower, and overcharging is way faster. But that's not even the best part. Just like with CE, I've made the overcharge bolt able to damage and track all enemies. And what's more, even knocking them back and throwing them off. Perfect for intercepting aggressive enemies. So now the plasma pistol is much more dynamic in the ways which you can use it against enemies. To balance out these buffs, including the plasma pistol's damage buff, I've reduced enemy accuracy when using it, so while very deadly when hit by it, its projectiles are easy to avoid. The brute plasma rifle has received a big increase to its rate of fire for the sake of differentiating it further from its counterpart. As such, it also has a much faster overheat time and a bigger penalty to its accuracy when dual wielded. Likewise with the plasma pistol, AI wielding the brute plasma rifle have had their accuracy nerfed to balance this out. Just make sure to stay on the move. The shotgun has received some minor fine-tuning. I decreased its damage but increased the number of projectiles fired from 10 to 15, just like the shotgun in CE. And I decreased its projectile speed so it's harder to use at range, but still something which the player can control by leading their shots. The Needler has been pretty much overhauled. It's now sort of a combination of the CE Needler and the Halo 3 Needler. The Super Combined now does much less damage, so tougher enemies take more than one to go down. But the blast radius and damage of the explosion has been increased so as to wreak havoc for surrounding enemies and great for triggering chain reactions. What's more, just like CE again, the Super Combined now has an EMP effect, meaning deadly consequences for elites and jackals caught within the area of effect. As for how the weapon behaves, it's pretty much identical to Halo 3's. Faster projectile speed, faster rate of fire, and identical fire rate acceleration. Unlike 3's though, 2 still has 30 needles per magazine, much lower projectile tracking, and no leading. So how well the weapon will perform relies heavily on the environment and the speed of the enemy. Dual wielding it though, despite my best efforts, is still fucking insane. Especially since there's still no reload penalty. But I did massively decrease the accuracy, and it's the only weapon I've made to always have the dual wielding accuracy penalty regardless of single or dual firing. Last thing for the Needler, I made the jackals resist being stunned when the needle impacts their shields. Moving on to the plasma grenade, I decreased its EMP radius so that you'll have to more skillfully time and position your throws to insta-kill elites, and thankfully now they're much more avoidable when thrown at the player. Lastly for weapons, I decreased the SMG, Magnum, and Shotgun's damage against energy shields. This not only helps in counterbalancing their various buffs, but also further emphasizes plasma weapons as the designated shield strippers, and bullet weapons as the health shredders. Now, I have made some small tweaks to vehicles. I increased the Warthog's acceleration and ground friction so it feels much smoother to drive, and subsequently this makes it easier to maneuver and splatter enemies. I decreased the player's damage resistance when driving the Scorpion to the same as the rest of the vehicles, so now tank sections are more of a challenge, and with its increased speed as of the previous version, emphasizes smart movement and positioning for minimum hits taken. In return though, you'll be happy to learn that I've made the passengers of not just the Scorpion, but with every other vehicle as well, take no damage from hits to the vehicle's body. differently. In vanilla Halo 2, with every hit the vehicle took, the passengers took a fraction of that damage, which could be very annoying as you'd be blindsided by banshees and within 2 seconds all your riders fall off dead. Now, passengers take no damage unless hit directly by enemy fire. On to AI changes, I took inspiration from Halo 2 Overhaul and made the shadows and outskirts fire at the turret's max rate of fire and decrease their leading. So now there's much heavier consequences for failing to avoid their bolts, but unlike vanilla, their bolts can actually be avoided now. With how I overhauled the balancing of the hunters in Halo CE, I figured I'd do the same thing in Halo 2 so they interact with the sandbox in much different and more interesting ways. First things first is I've increased their health even further than the previous version. Because the thing is with Halo 2's hunters, it's not hard to get them stun locked and basically defenseless. So increasing their health helps to extend their encounters into ones where the player is encouraged to go ham on them and throw them everything they've got. And to do that, various parts of the sandbox have been tuned to be much more effective on hunters. For one thing, we've all always spammed grenades at hunters whenever they appear. Well, in vanilla, that barely did any damage. So here, I increased the damage explosions due to them. But since they have increased health, this buff doesn't so much make grenades overpowered to use on them, so much as it makes them just as effective as the other weapons. This buff also applies to Needler super combines, which, speaking of, I made the Needler projectiles attached to their armor and capable of super combining, whereas in vanilla they just bounced off. This is something I did in my CE rebalanced as well, making the Needlers super effective on hunters. Only in 2 now, it doesn't so much take them down super quickly as it does stun lock them, which, considering the Needler's new crazy rate of fire and projectile speed, is just as fun. The energy sword and brute shot melee now actually do damage on them, but you're gonna have to hack and slash quite a bit before they go down. Just like in my CE rebalance, I made plasma weapons penetrate through the hunter's armor, though with less damage than shooting their skin. The trade-off for this being that plasma now does less damage to them than in vanilla, and now less than bullets. So now plasma weapons have a unique role against hunters in that they can punch through their armor but with less damage output than bullet-firing weapons. Last thing for hunters, to further counterbalance these tweaks, I increased their target leading when firing their particle cannons, so they're a bigger threat at range even with persistent movement, emphasizing stunning them or closing the gap. Moving on to brutes, since I decreased their health so much, I wanted to add more caveats to fighting them so there's more thought involved in their encounters. I increased the amount of health they recharge after a certain amount of time, so there's more commitment in engaging individual targets. I slightly increased the damage their helmets can take before falling off, just to make sure headshot weapons don't become the only weapons used on them. A big tweak is that brutes now largely resist melee damage, and what's more, I made them immune from assassination. So now facing them in close quarters calls for a lot more caution, as reckless melee combat is ill-advised. Unless you have a sword or brute shot, which are still very effective. But keep in mind, higher ranking brutes will take more swipes to go down. Now on to Flood. I've made combat and infection forms more aggressive. In CE, the Flood were the enemy that behaved totally differently from the Covenant. They would rush the player down in large numbers, putting you on the defensive and call for quick thinking and swift movement. In vanilla Halo 2, they tend to meander around a lot more, behaving more like spongy nuisances. In Rebalance, since they have their health decreased back to around CE's levels, it's only fitting that they fill the same aggressive role. So now their encounters are much more intense and much more interesting since they now force the player to switch up their tactics compared to fighting other enemies and think on their feet. And to go along with making the Flood feel more overwhelming, carriers will now spawn 4 times as many infection forms. So if you're not careful, it could lead to being swarmed by a sea of the little fuckers. This also gives grenades more of a role since they not only quickly dispatch the infection forms, but also destroy dead combat forms so they can't be reanimated, which is now much more pertinent to keep an eye on. And for that, I've increased melee damage against combat forms. However, when they're alive, they still resist melee by a bit, so there it's more of a last resort. In keeping with making the Flood feel overwhelming and putting the player on the defensive, I've made them non-headshotable. Also, because unlike other enemies, their reaction to being killed by headshot is so dull, which obviously isn't good for the fun factor if it's such an effective tactic. However, even if they can't be headshotted anymore, their core still takes bonus damage and will kill them much faster. For the battle rifle and carbine, I've instead made them do extra damage on combat forms, similar to Halo CE with a pistol. And considering that they show you whenever you're aiming at their core via a small dot in the reticle, these weapons still have the same role of locating and eliminating their weak spot and are still very effective. Lastly, I've increased plasma bolt damage against combat forms, so those weapons are a bit more viable, but still not as good as bullet weapons. Now for the Heretic Leader. I've made his hollow drones do no damage at all. 1, because that makes no goddamn sense, and 2, with the buffs I've made to the plasma rifle's projectile speed and damage, the boss fight would be even more restrictive and punishing than it already is. Trust me, the real Heretic Leaders still doing damage with his dual plasma rifles are still a giant threat. And even if the hollow drones don't do any damage anymore, you're not gonna know that until you actually look at your shields. So it's going along with the fight's intention of faking the player out and calling on them to be more observant to find the real target. The Tartarus fight in vanilla was pretty dull, mostly because you couldn't damage him at all until Johnson took out his shields. And waddling around evading a very slow enemy waiting until you can shoot isn't exactly what I'd call good gameplay. So the Tartarus fight has received a slew of new tweaks. For one thing, I increased the radius of his hammer's explosion, so there's a bigger need to keep your distance. Every weapon now does a small amount of damage to his shields, so now there's actually a reason to, interact with the boss and not just wait around. Furthermore, this also means you're not just watching doing nothing as your elite allies throw themselves at him in vain. What's more, his shields will now drain from EMP, meaning bringing a plasma pistol or needler and sticking him will give you an advantage in dealing more damage. Hopefully the boss is a little more exciting as now you're encouraged to throw everything you have at him to finally bring the bastard down. For Sentinels, I decreased the damage bullets do to them, so now Plasma actually has more of an advantage on them, just like in CE. For the Enforcer, I significantly increased the damage their rockets do. As in Vanilla, they were ridiculously weak, so now you actually have to evade them as they rain down upon you. I've made friendly AI more accurate when using the sniper rifle and beam rifle, as in Vanilla they were pretty laughable in that regard, so now there's more of a benefit to arming them with snipers at the cost of suppressive capability. I adjusted the enemy marine firing patterns on Secret Icon and Quarantine Zone so they fire more similarly as to when they're on your side. As a result, I found that Marines specifically punish aggressive rushdowns and reckless running and gunning, which I think makes a lot of sense given their more tactical nature compared to other enemies. So now you'll have to consider intelligent cover use and flanking much more in their encounters, even in vehicle sections as their new firing patterns also apply there. Just like with my CE rebalanced, I've increased the max firing range for almost all AI, so instead of just standing around waiting to be picked off at super long range, enemies will still actually resist the player. This change doesn't impact Halo 2 anywhere near as much as CE, but it does add much more urgency to vehicle sections, specifically the bridge section in Metropolis, as now the Ghosts and Wraith turrets fire from much further away, calling for the player to actually consider strafing and using the tip trucks for cover. Speaking of individual levels, I've also made tweaks to their AI and spawns. I turned the plasma pistol dual-wielding elites at the beginning of Cairo Station into elite rangers. No special reason, I just thought it didn't make sense considering they clearly didn't come from the first boarding craft, so they had to have found a way into the station from the outside. I made a portion of the Flood combat forms in Oracle have shields, just like they do in later levels. Because for Halo 2, the fact that certain Flood have shields I found is an important part of balancing how they interact with weapons. Shields give plasma weapons more use and act as a roadblock for headshot weapons. And while you can't headshot them anymore, the battle rifle and carbine is still great to use on them at range, and considering how long the Flood take before they move in the elevator section, it just adds a little bit more depth to make sure the carbine won't reign supreme in that encounter, and gives the Flood a chance to get close, like they should. Not to mention the fact that they have shields adds more visual feedback to when they're shot, which, in my onion, is always a good thing. In Regret, I removed the dual-wielding plasma rifle elites in the boss fight at the end of the level, as their time to kill is way too fast for an encounter where you have to leave yourself vulnerable repeatedly. I didn't want to remove the single wielders though, as I think they add some depth to the fight that it really needs. The idea is that the player should have to decide between prioritizing taking out the ranged or sword honor guards to make things easier on themselves. Making them all have swords would take away that dimension to this fight. I added twice as many elite allies on the gondola ride in Quarantine Zone. In Vanilla, this was without a doubt the worst part of the game, in no small part because of the damage sponge infinite spawning Flood, but also because the game gave you so few allies that they'd be wiped out within the first few waves, leaving the player to face the Flood hordes alone, where the optimal strategy then was just to hide somewhere and wait for 7 minutes before the gondola reached its destination, which, I don't think that's fun. So with more allies backing you up, they'll last much longer, and hopefully this encourages the player to actually engage in the fight themselves. For Gravemind, I fixed the player's starting shields and health, and also fixed the starting needler so it actually has a full magazine. I also fixed the prison section so that you can actually sneak through it like the game wants you to, instead of just being detected immediately. This was achieved simply through removing the brutes by the gravity lift, which would alert everybody upon being killed. Since they're now immune to assassination anyway, this removal is doubly important. In Uprising, you could steal an enemy Spectre and have your elite allies climb aboard, but for some reason it's scripted to only allow the gunner and one passenger, so I kept that Spectre spawn but also spawned in a second unmanned Spectre, which is actually capable of seating at full capacity. This, combined with the elite Zealot now being capable of using vehicles, means an even more exciting time as you and your elite brethren tear through the roots. High Charity is the shortest level in Halo 2, where you can just run through most of the 3-way combat encounters, and while that might have been intended given the context of the story, it doesn't make for a good level. So I did what I could to make it so the player couldn't just ignore the enemies as much. I tweaked enemy types, weapons, and numbers in key areas to force the player to contend with them more before moving on. And for not just High Charity, but all Flood levels, their numbers have been increased in some encounters. Not just with more combat forms, but also more infection and carrier forms, specifically on Quarantine Zone. The gondola fight in particular has more depth to it now since you can target the carriers to blow away the horde around it. To wrap it up, we have some miscellaneous changes that I thought would be neat. I gave the plasma rifle bolt a long blue wisp, which better suits its now faster projectile speed, similar to CE. I gave the plasma pistol's overcharge bolt a busier glow effect to look more powerful since it actually does damage now and can track every enemy. I made the Spec Ops Elite armor actually black again, whereas in vanilla they were a weird indigo color, so now they fit in with the Spec Ops grunts and resemble their CE counterparts. Hopefully now people won't be confusing Spec Ops Elites with miners. Last change I think some levels will benefit from greatly is that I've increased the size and range of Master Chief's flashlight. This helps a lot in darker sections of levels and especially High Charity. Now, if only I could figure out how to stop it from automatically turning off in areas the game deems as bright areas. I still have a handful of things I'd like to tweak, but don't know how to do so or are out of my reach with the tools I have. But I hope you have a blast playing through the new and improved Rebalanced of Halo 2. If you liked the video, a like and sub would be greatly appreciated. And consider supporting me on Patreon to help me make more gaming content and animation. Peace out!